Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank Lear for agreeing and inviting us to have this panel. Whenever you start on a new field, a new policy thinking, it's always difficult to get uptake. And we've been very impressed how quickly this topic of gender has managed to get traction, at least in Western Europe, North America. I think we have some more work to do in other parts of the world. But it's certainly been very encouraging to see the response that we've had to our project. So we're going to be talking about our toolkit, and I was just joking with my panelists that every time we speak, you have to hold it up and take a look. This is the toolkit that we'll be talking about. And the idea of the toolkit and the project that accompanied was to provide guidance on integrating gender considerations into competition policy. The toolkit primarily addresses the role of women as consumers in markets. And we hope that the next iteration of the toolkit will expand beyond that to look more at women as firm owners and to consider issues of more concern to private practitioners such as compliance. The toolkit is a result of research and evidence gathered over the past 5 years. It's extremely evidence-based. This is not an opinion-based tool. And particularly with the support of Canada, we really could not have done it without Canada's vision and their visionary efforts to make this possible. So while gender is traditionally considered as competition rather, is considered as gender blind, this toolkit and the supporting research demonstrates that in fact gender can play a determinant role in many aspects of competition policy. For example, if we apply a gender lens to the differences in consumer behaviors and incorporating these differences in economic analysis can lead authorities to make decisions that better protect the interests of women and also help consumers more broadly. Our panel today is comprised of contributors to the development of this toolkit. Each is an author of a research paper that formed the basis of the toolkit. Through their presentations, you're going to learn two things. The first is that effective competition policy can play a role in addressing gender equality without having a negative impact on competition. And we don't need to throw out, as I just said, the consumer welfare framework and an economic approach to competition policy in order to do so. The second point we're going to make is that adopting a gender lens can help us do competition policy better. And it can help us achieve better outcomes. So we're not distracting off of the purpose of competition, but in fact we're making it better. So the toolkit provides guidance on how to apply a gender lens in areas such as market definition and competitive effects analysis, data collection and surveys, remedies such as those in merger review, cartels, collusion and investigations, and also compliance, advocacy, as well as ex post assessment. And I would emphasize the toolkit, and we are not saying that you always have to apply a gender lens when looking at competition, but it's worth stopping for a moment to think whether or not gender might play a role in the issues in front of you. Then that does not necessarily mean that you have to do extensive research each time, but just to stop and think whether or not gender might be relevant. And we can't deal with all of the topics in the toolkit today, so we've selected a few just to give you an idea of the wealth that you'll find within the toolkit, and also on our website where all of the papers are available, and then links to others who are doing work in this emerging field. So our first speaker today, and I'm going to pass the field because we are pass the microphone because we're on a tight timeline. I'm going to pass it over to Lisa. And Lisa Pignao from Analysis Group, they provided one of the most important papers to the toolkit.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Let me see if our slides work. There we go. All right, perfect. So maybe let me start. When my colleagues and I embarked on this journey with our colleagues at the OECD, we're an economist group. So we cared about the data, the economics, how does the modeling work, and of course we started from a perspective of, well, if you could, right, control for everything. If you could take a gender lens and even gender plus or racial lens, you would want to make sure, you're considering, for example, for a merger, how different subgroups are impacted. Ideally, you'd always want to do that. Now we're also, as economists, we think of everything in terms of cost benefit. So we're like, well, but that would be costly. You need to gather all the data. You need to have all this information. when is it really going to be worth doing? And we just started from the idea that let's find an example. Let's look at a case where we could, just based on public data, without having sort of private information from parties, let's look at what we could figure out and whether we could find good examples. And it was interesting because even though it wasn't really part of what we were looking at, that first exercise forced us to think, what would be the good examples? What are the things that we care about? And so we started thinking, well, we want to look at some products. We want them to be differentiated by genders. We want it to be very obvious. We want it to be both in the characteristics of the products that even though they are the same products, maybe for men and women, they're sold in different ways, and you can actually, in some cases, even see a premium. And of course, I kind of gave it away with the slide, but when looking out in the marketed data, the disposable shavers or razors, depending on where you live, were a very clean example that we came with. And the first part about the product characteristics and customer identity. And there's a third piece, which is how people buy the products. We're all sort of byproducts of our search for what would be good examples that we could show to people. And so that ended up in the toolkit, as Lynn was just saying. If you take a stop and you start looking and thinking, is this product one where I should think about this? And so part of the toolkit, part of our work goes through that. But we were always aimed at the data piece. That was what we cared about. And so we thought, if you're thinking about this ahead of time, not because there's already a merger, not because all the data's out there, but you're trying to figure out if you need to consider it, what data do you have available and that you can actually leverage? And so the pieces up here, the 1 and the 2, are sort of the ideal data, right? The transaction level data, the data from the companies that have everything about their marketing, how they sell, to whom, through what channels, etc. You probably don't have that when you start, but what do you have? And nowadays, in a lot of fields of economics, we use what we call user-generated data. So you can go online and you can scrape the web, and in this case, we went through Amazon, and we could look at all the products that are sold. There's actually a ton of information, right? You have pictures, you have how the product is marketed. In these cases, it was very clear if it was for a woman, for a man. We have the characteristics, the number of blades, the number of shavers in one package, so we can get to the price of the individual units for different groups. Then we have reviews. And the reviews can have a lot of information because people can say, oh, I used to buy this product, but now I buy this one and I really like it. So there's information about substitution. And also there's information implicitly about market share. Even if you don't have the actual market shares, if you know that one product gets 20 times more reviews than another, it probably means that it's selling more than the other. And so we just went purely from this available data and ran some simulations. So we had, I think, 7 or 8 big players, hundreds of products. We were able to collect that, pretty automatically right now. We're not saying, go by hand and try to write this down. You can kind of collect it very easily these days. And let me see if I can get, maybe not. Oops, there we go. I was too bad. And then we did some math with it, which is what we wanted to play with. And even with this very, I guess, cheaply collected data, we could run some modeling, some simulations, and see what the impact would be. So, there's a HHI change, and it was quite clear that for the women, it was, larger than for the men. But what is that weird thing with all the green and the yellow? So this was a market simulation where we took the big player and a very small player, sort of a new entrant, but that was very active in the women area and had sort of some novel products, etc. So when you looked at it from the outside, just from the market share, the new entrant was very small. And so the merge didn't appear like it would be something that would be problematic. And you can kind of see that on the left-hand side if you just did the simulation based on the overall, well, I guess you can see it. There's a lot of yellow and a little bit of green. And that means, it's not very scary. Now, you might wonder why there's a grid. Obviously, the impact is going to depend on brand loyalty, so how much people are willing to switch within brands, and then how easy it is for people to just switch completely from this market, right? So if you don't want to use a disposable razor, you can use an electric one, you can do depilation, you can do other things, right? So how much people are willing to switch based on price is going to affect the impact, but so we just did some reasonable scenarios. And both on the side of the just the whole market, it wasn't very scary. For the men's market only, it was all yellow, which in our sort of is the best case scenario, the lowest impact. But then when you looked at the women's product, because this new entrant was very active in this area, then the impact was much larger. And this is just the impact for the industry wide, but if you look just at emerging parties, it was even higher. So we just wanted to look at what could happen and how much you could tell from just public data. And this was one example that actually, just from this data, you can have some pretty interesting ideas about what is and what isn't likely going to be problematic. And other mergers between other groups of the same industry didn't necessarily have the same result. So it really was specific to different parties, I think.
Thank you. I'll now turn the floor over to my colleague, Carolina.
Thank you, Lynn. Does it work? Yeah. So a second area that is covered in the toolkit is cartel investigations. So I just wanted to briefly show some of the research that backs the information that is in the toolkit. As Lynn was saying, this is strongly evidence-based. One main piece of research that inspired the recommendations of the toolkit is a paper I co-wrote with Alexis Brunel from the French Competition Authority, which is an analysis of French cartel practice under this gender lens. And the DICE Institute replicated the same framework and the same methodology using data from German cartels, and they obtained very similar results. So the most recent research follows a multidisciplinary approach, which is based on insights and evidence from different branches of research, such as gender studies, behavioral economics, cartel studies, white-collar crime literature, and this was complemented and built upon with evidence from cartel cases. So the first thing that emerges from this research is that the cartels are really not just economic agreements, but they are mainly social organizations that are structured around social relationships and cultural norms. And the core coalitions that are at the center of most cartel interactions are generally mostly composed by men. There was very old research on white-collar crimes that suggested that there is a natural predisposition for illicit behavior that men have and women don't have, or this is due to nature of men and women, but this is absolutely not the case. What this is really about is about opportunity to join the core coalitions of cartels. And this opportunity is shaped by social norms and network dynamics that are strongly male-dominated and that tend to exclude women. So what we see is that cartels function primarily through male-dominated informal networks that are often referred to as boys' clubs, and these informal networks tend to exclude women. What we found is also that these networks are created and reinforced on the basis of shared masculine values, loyalty and trust dynamics, and homosocial patterns, so the unconscious often preference to work and interact with people that are just like us. And in turn, all of these features, they support the creation and the maintenance of cartel practices well beyond what rational choice theory would predict. So one of the conclusions is that the continued gender imbalance in certain areas of the economy and in certain industries is actually an important risk factor for cartel practices. And this is relevant for enforcers, but also for everyone who works in compliance. So what can be done and why this is important if the objective is to deter cartel and also catch cartels. A first point is that behavioral considerations in this area are quite important, because indeed there is a correlation between boys clubs dynamics and the preservation of cartel behavior. So behavioral analysis of the people that are part of cartels and their interactions amongst each other and within the institution they work for are really relevant to better understand the deterrence and the incentives of people to participate in cartels. Indeed, the economic incentives and the economic considerations on the choice of cartelizing or not cartelizing are really not telling the full story, because these informal networks are much more powerful than any economic theory in this area, and we really went cartel by cartel for 10 years of cartel. We had access to all the internal documents of the French Competition Authority. Thanks to my colleague, I couldn't see them, they were anonymized, but we really were able to analyze all the interactions, the language that was used, the relationships among the different cartelists. So this is a very important element, and in general, all these considerations are quite important for the advancement of cartel prevention and detection. So there are a few elements that can help identify, together with traditional indicators that of course are still very relevant, industries that are more at risk of collusion. So for example, actions that competition authorities can undertake are reviewing the homogeneity of groups that are suspected of cartel behavior, to better understand the cartel dynamics and also other cartelists that might not be uncovered. It might sound very simplistic, but often people begin conversations around the possibility to collude because they went to high school together and now they play in the tennis club, in the same tennis club, and they keep meeting in this informal context. So looking at these formal but also, most importantly, informal networks and the prior relationships among cartelists can really help identify opportunity to cartelize and to collude. So to conclude, I think Lynn is looking at me. I think this is also quite important for advocacy efforts from the competition authority side, directed, for example, at business associations of industries that are more prone to collusion, not only according to traditional indicators, but also to everything I just said. And also explaining the compliance risks associated with these informal networks that can help inform how internal compliance is carried out, including this element of gender imbalance that can really make the difference between the choice of colluding or not colluding. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. And Bill, I'll turn over to you.
First, thanks to Canada for setting us down the path, leading the way with the idea, to Lynn and the OECD for picking it up and carrying it forward, and certainly to Lear for giving us a platform. My interest in the project was to focus on how agencies can take steps to effectuate durable change, how to take the concept and make it a routine part of the agency's operations. I think this is a challenge for many areas of policy change where you're trying to introduce a new concept to case handlers and others who've been accustomed to doing work in a traditional way. I think there are two ways of making it stick. One is to persuade the actors that the consideration in question, in fact, will make them better at doing their jobs. It's so that it's not something that they have to do, but it's something that they want to do because it will make them more effective. The second element is to show that in some respects they're already doing it. That is to take account of past experience. If you want someone to take a step and it seems alien or intimidating, it's helpful to say you've already done it in the past, so you needn't be scared about it. It's something you can take on. Those are two ideas about how to make it stick. I want to mention 4 things that identified in the paper for the project that can help do this. One is the fairly obvious but important starting point of achieving appropriate diversity in the key leadership positions and decision-making positions in the agency. And the assumption here, and I think it's supported by a good deal of research, is that as you broaden the perspectives on the board in the case units at the leadership position, you're more likely to have a broader awareness of considerations that might not have been obvious if you don't have that type of diversity. I think it's also an obvious point that to anyone who's taught for a while and looks at the flow of talent through university programs, in 35 years of teaching, a disproportionate number of my students in the class at the high end are women. So that if you're trying to make a pitch to an agency to promote this kind of diversification, the simple point to make is that's where the talent is. And the question for you is, would you like to be better or worse? Better would be an improvement. You're not doing anybody a favor by looking for the best talent. The only person you're doing a favor for is yourself. It's been interesting to see. We did a survey of leadership patterns in agencies, and there's an interesting modern trend to promoting greater representation at the top end. The ACCC and the CMA were 2 of the holdouts, but both have women in key leadership positions now. Quick quiz for the audience. What is the oldest and most significant competition agency that has never had a woman in the leadership position? There you go, Thomas, correct. And you get one of these lovely LCF bags as a prize if you'll come up afterwards to claim your prize. Germany, the oldest of the European systems, if we put that island to the west of France out of the picture for a second. Never. I don't think even close. Interesting question about the future. I think it's helpful to identify some of the outliers. That's one of them, a glaring one. So one obvious approach is to ensure that you've got a broad representation. And again, you're not doing it because you have to do, you're doing it because you want to. That's where the talent is. And the simple question, you want to be better or worse? Your choice. Second is to look at past experience to identify areas in which you've already done some of these things, though perhaps under a different label. I looked at all of the Federal Trade Commission's budget requests and enforcement activities since 1960 forward. I was struck at the number of instances in which I could see attentiveness to these considerations, maybe not set out as a basis for the decision to prosecute, but how frequently these considerations, I think, in fact, factored in the decision to allocate resources. 2 examples. One, a major allocation of resources over time to encourage the entry of paraprofessionals into fields such as healthcare, legal services. The FTC has run over time a large number of cases, certainly in my early time at the FTC in the late 70s, dealing with nurse midwives and other paraprofessionals in the healthcare sector, overwhelmingly populated by women. And this had a major entry dimension for getting new service providers into the field. But second, this was all labor. This was labor before labor was cool. So the notion that you'd look at these considerations is not necessarily new, but it's striking to see how powerful a feature in the decision to prosecute. A more recent example from 2002, when I was head of legal services at the FTC, we had a merger case that involved cervical cancer treatments, a case called Cytec Digene, which blocked a merger. Not only powerful gender significance in the case, it was all an R&D market, forward R&D markets, all the way back to the research and development process. Yeah, that's innovation. Innovation before innovation became cool. It was the heart and soul of the case. In so many instances, if you take a look at what you've done before, you'll find exemplars that show that major considerations, in fact, have factored into the decision to prosecute. It's not a big step to keep doing it and to look at it more consciously and systematically. Third observation is, I think for the future, and Lynn pointed to this, I think access to the market to increase entrepreneurship is maybe even more important than measuring markets and looking at markets more. That is, what's the path to economic growth? A large literature on economic development and entry into markets shows that it's rare that individuals start with a big bang and come up with a big idea that suddenly makes them billionaires. Mark Zuckerberg is an outlier in this respect. Usually there's a progression in which you go through a series of steps when you learn. Getting in on the lower rung, starting a small business in the area of food services, having a food truck, running a food truck, can be the basis of expanding into a larger food services role in the sector. If you don't get the first step, you're far behind. And having the first step is crucial in getting underway and getting started. Programs that dismantle unjustifiable artificial barriers to access into the market can be enormously helpful. So, one example from the FTC's experience, a study that looked at restrictions that states imposed on e-commerce. One of the most important examples involved a woman who'd created a vineyard, was a very successful winemaker, but was blocked by restrictions on e-commerce from selling her wine across borders. The FTC's advocacy helped knock those barriers down. You get into the market, you have a role to play, you can grow, you can become the big company later on. Fourth and finally, the importance of having a research program that identifies obstacles to access to the market. The workshop that invites people to talk about their stories, how they got into the market, how they're having trouble getting into the market, using that as a basis for examining why underrepresented groups don't have a greater role to play in the market, and obviously that can be scaled in directions that go beyond gender to economic disadvantage generally. These are all practical steps that agencies can take, and I'd emphasize none of them are completely different from what they've done before. So, why do it? It's good for you. Second, you've done it before. Thanks.
What passion. I love it.
Thank you, Bill. On that note about entry into market, I'd signal that there's members of the South African Competition Commission recently put out a paper to identify what a competition authority can do to help women enter the market as business owners, and it's an extremely interesting paper, and it is available on their website. On that, I'm going to turn to Ellen, who's online for us. Unfortunately, she couldn't join us, and it is very early in the morning for her in Canada, so thank you very much, Ellen, and over to you.
We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Sorry about that. And can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'll just start with a short disclaimer. So the views I'll express are my own and not those of the Government of Canada or the Competition Bureau or the Commissioner of Competition. And I just need to add another disclaimer. Lynn mentioned the time, so I'll just mention it again, and that can explain anything lacking in my presentation. So I'll kind of provide a bit of an agency perspective on the toolkit. I can't speak on behalf of the Competition Bureau, but I can tell you what I've observed. And I think it's really important to start with the fact that many people across the Competition Bureau wanted to be involved in developing the toolkit. It started small. It was a real grassroots effort. A small group on the International Affairs team needed to do this work, needed to do this analysis to understand the link between gender and competition in a defensible, evidence-based way, because we were asked to do it by the government. But historically, we might have answered not applicable. But as we were talking about it, we couldn't get away from the fact that how can we say that if the work had never been done in terms of a literature review or sort of evidence. And as Bill said, the work has been done, but there hadn't been sort of a collection of research and insights about it that we could point to for our analysis. So we helped put the issue on the radar for funding for research after we couldn't find anything. And the topic got more and more traction over time at the Bureau. And staff across the Bureau in every enforcement area and advocacy area provided an on-the-ground perspective as they worked with the draft and tried to apply the insights. So over 50 Bureau employees gave really detailed feedback on the Bureau, on the toolkit itself. And talking about how the toolkit has been received, the main word that's come up across the organization is helpful. People say that this toolkit, like others have mentioned, will help us do our jobs better. We can have guidance and a stepwise approach to look at whether different consumers are affected differently. We can examine the characteristics of markets, and gender might be a very relevant feature. So this better understanding can help us better define markets and measure impact, as Lisa has shown today. More nuanced understanding can help us better set priorities and craft remedies. And this goes to the point that Lynn mentioned, that we can achieve what's called a double dividend, more competitive and more equitable markets. And at the very least, we can arrive at a much more nuanced understanding of how markets function in reality, informed by actual and not just theoretical behaviors. As Bill pointed out, I mentioned this is not a completely new idea. Enforcement and advocacy decisions require choices. We've been looking at factors like vulnerability, impact, and trying hard to understand the relevant features of markets for a long time. What might be different now are two things: integrating the considerations in a more systematic way, and the actual availability of disaggregated data, which we need in order to integrate this in our systems and procedures, and the toolkit provides a path to do that. So at the Bureau, we are in the midst of considering how we can use the insights in the toolkit. Already, teams are using this guidance in their work, and special projects are emerging. One, for example, is how we collect and use disaggregated data in our complaints process. And I thought it might be interesting to talk a bit about the ways that Toolkit's insights can be applied to our work as an agency. So we talked already a bit about competition analysis. So there's a great deal of guidance in the toolkit about how to use disaggregated data for analyzing markets. And one of the biggest reasons that people said why we hadn't done these types of analysis before is that we just didn't have the data. But now, in an era of big data, the chances that we can get and use the data are much higher. So this applies both to enforcement and also to market studies. So for example, we asked questions around demographic characteristics, including gender, in the survey that informed the grocery market study that we published recently. In terms of program design, there's insights in the toolkits that go beyond competition analysis. And two excellent examples are insights on motivators to be a whistleblower and insights on compliance, as Carolina talked about. And we've already used the compliance-based insights in the redesign of our compliance guidance, including signaling the value and according value to having diverse boards. Because, as Carolina mentioned, the evidence shows that non-diverse board can be a very big risk factor. And so we talked a bit about case selection and prioritization, and we already have factors for cases where vulnerable and underserved communities were harmed, and that these cases were prioritized. But I think a new aspect is that agencies, including the Competition Bureau, have intelligence functions across many enforcement areas. So integrating this lens as we monitor markets, as we do proactive case building and detection, will make a difference. And in terms of agency operations, the insights in the toolkit also speak to representation. We have ongoing monitoring of representation and hiring for gender and other identity factors. And representation depends on hiring, but also what are the factors for inclusion? How included do people feel? And our focus is as much on retention and having a workplace where everyone is included and respected. So just in terms of the last slide, the work ahead and implications. So the toolkit offers us a chance to achieve even more nuance and rigor in our work. Part of it is about culture too, about valuing this work. Sometimes this work can be seen as an extra, a nice to have. We can do it with existing expertise. Anyone can do it within existing timeframes and budgets. And I don't think that's the case. And it's important not to see this work as extracurricular or outside for core functions, rather as part of our core function. And as a way to help us arrive at better and more efficient outcomes. But it does take expertise, time, and money. So achieving these outcomes, it's only possible if we integrate the insights into our systems and ways of working. So just a few thoughts on systems, because I do think that a systems approach is one way to achieve sustainability. So the need for a strong change management program. The second is integrating these considerations in corporate functions so that what gets measured gets done. And we've got a lot of this in place now at the Competition Bureau. You can see reference to this in our annual plans, our performance management agreements, and the type of training we offer. And the third is making sure that all the internal systems that we have reflect gender considerations and other equity considerations. And so one way, for example, is adding a prompt or a step to general investigative processes to consider whether gender or other identity factors could be a relevant characteristic in a market, in intelligence as well, and in analytical processes too. And one of the most important systemic considerations is resourcing, money, people, and time. Integrating some of these insights takes a relatively smaller amount of effort, like adjusting language in a compliance building or bulletin, or presentation. But others are more major, sourcing data, analyzing data, getting experts ready to be able to provide reports and support them through that. And so project plans really need to take into account the time and money it will need to do these types of analysis, including the surveys and the analysis that I mentioned. And I also wanted to flag that it takes extra time compared to when we don't do this thinking by default. As we work toward change management, as we work toward changing systems, is the extra time that this will take built into the project plan? Are we adjusting employees' existing workload to account for this work? And it will take more money. So making sure we have the budget there is important. So those are just some of the systems to consider to make this work sustainable and not just depend on the person who gets assigned a case or project. And it's worth it. By integrating the insights, we can make more informed decisions and better protect and promote competition for consumers and businesses. And I just do want to close by saying how grateful we are for the work of Lisa, Carolina, Bill, and the other authors, and Lynn and the OECD. We're really indebted to them for building the evidentiary basis to help us do our jobs better. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. And there's a couple of takeaways. One is that we would, in the future, need to look at some sort of cost-benefit analysis and benchmarking, whether or not how much of a difference in incorporating a gender lens makes. And I also take away that a lot of what we've done hasn't actually been very new. We can go back to Becker's paper in 1956-7, where we know that employers actually gave up profits for those who indulge in their labor market discriminatory tastes. We have a few minutes for questions, if there are any. This is your chance. Or do you just feel like you know it and you're willing to go out and apply the toolkit now?
Or you're ready for the break.
or you're ready for your coffee.
No, I really would like to know a little bit more about the implications for fighting cartels of the analysis that you've done. It seems to me that your work shows that social networks are important, and women are outside of those social networks. But what would happen if they join those networks. Would they have the same attitude toward cartelization or not? What's your idea?
In the way we structured this analysis to find this correlation, we classified, again, we went cartel by cartel, and we collected all the information on the different cartelists, anonymized, but with the gender variable. And we classified the role that women had. So we saw that in 98% of cartels, for example, women were not part of the core coalition of these cartels. When women were part of the cartel, they had generally two different roles. They either had a support role, so with a secretarial type of function. They were excluded from the core coalition, but they had a support role. They were not really involved in the key exchanges, or they had a maverick role. This is how we defined it. So they were a very small minority of the core coalition. They were in it more for pressure from the group they were part of, and they were the ones that started the process that led to the cartel being prosecuted. Only in one case we found that there was a woman part of the core coalition of the cartel, but she had a very different role, and we were able to see really the language also that was used, and her role in the core coalition was different in the sense that she really thought that what they were doing was the best corporate strategy. She had no element of this informal network, while we saw in the exchanges between the so-called boys clubs that were really, even the language was strongly based on loyalty. They were talking about being knighted as becoming part of this core coalition, to an extent we were not really expecting. But I do think that if in some industries there were environments where women network would be prevalent, we could find just as many cartels. It's really about these homosocial patterns and the fact that it's the same gender, and then by coincidence in most industries the prevalent gender is men. But that's why I made the point about this is not really about any intrinsic nature of women being against illicit behavior. Is really not the case. Is more the exclusion from the majority group. And also, I mean, this is the cartels that the competition authorities found. So maybe the cartels that we haven't found are all run by women. I don't know. They're just better at it.
Exactly.
Thank you. I just had a question that came through my mind. Have you observed in any way commercial practices that by offering substantially identical products, by the time these products are offered or targeted to women, charge higher prices? It's just a different way of looking at discrimination. And I don't know if and how this could have an impact under strict competition law, but it's yet another way of looking at discrimination.
Yes, I think, I mean, it's referred to as what we call the pink tax, is, when the same product is higher. It's been shown in a lot of areas, toys for children, clothing, I mean, razors, these sort of things where it's socially hard to change to the other side, even if the product does the same thing. There are places where, for example, in the US, there's some laws that were, sort of enacted to try to say that would be forbidden, but it's very hard to actually show. And I mean, it was one of the things that we thought was so strange about just looking at the data on Amazon. It was so obvious. And it's not just like I showed two examples, but it was over the hundreds of products. If you look at the women product and the equivalent men product, they were quite a bit more expensive. So it's still out there, and you're right that it's, we were focused on the fact it exacerbates the pink tax, but the pink tax was there all along, which is in and of itself something to consider and look at, definitely.
Can I?
Yeah, please.
There's some wonderfully well-documented examples in the services sector, going back through the, goodness, 50s, 60s, 70s coming forward. One of the most intriguing examples involved dry cleaning, where the cost of dry cleaning, say, a man's shirt was dramatically less than the cost of dry cleaning a woman's shirt, and it's a difference that could not be attributed to materials design. It was simply a large premium. This was addressed in an interesting way that didn't involve law enforcement. This was an issue that basically sat on the boundary between consumer protection and competition law. But there was a study done, what we would call a market study, that looked at these patterns and documented striking differences in the prices charged. I suppose by force of shame and by awareness, dry cleaners backed off of that. Now, I don't know if they did that by simply raising the price of men's shirts, which is perhaps what they did, just to realize that they weren't charging enough. But this was an instance in which a good market study that looks at patterns and services, you could look at other products as well, can be enormously informative. And this led, I think, to what could be called a universal change in the practice throughout North America. Dry cleaning.
Any other questions? No. And just to see if our panelists have any final words, or no?
I see this in a way as very much tied to the larger question of what a economic system should do. You know, the notion of fairness can be hazy and hard to define, but I think one objective of a system of law is to enable people with talent to achieve the fullest possible realization of that capability, whoever they are. Part of what I like about what Ellen and her colleagues in Canada did is that the concepts here don't simply apply to gender, they could be applied to race or economic disadvantage generally. That is, why does poverty persist in some areas? Why are some groups never routinely represented in the mainstream of commerce? I think there are a host of reasons, but some of them involve, again, access to the marketplace. And not only do you improve the likely wealth of society if people who have talent exercise it, but I think human beings are much more at peace with the way the economy operates if they feel they have had a full chance to do their best. They don't expect that they will be the best in class. You learn in sport that there's usually somebody better out there than you are, but if they surpass you because of their greater capability, at least you feel you were able to run your best race, and you can accept that. What's hard to swallow is the idea that you never got a chance to run. Or if you had to run, you had to carry a heavy weight along with you. So I see the project that Canada has set in motion here and that Lynn and her colleagues have nurtured has broader significance for the way in which the economy operates and the sense of its citizens that it is fair to the respect that it gives people with talent the opportunity to use it.
Ellen, did you have any last words? No? Okay. Well, I certainly can't summarize as well as Bill, because he more or less said what I wanted to say too. So I'll leave you with those final words. Thank you very much for your attention.